Oh yeah. Now we'll bring the funk, boys. Yeah, right up to ya.
Jam too. Jam too. Jam too.
No pens, no pens, no pens.
Testing, testing, testing.
Virgo opposes Saturn in Pisces. So that's going to be a huge lunation there on the 19th. Then a few days later, we have Venus squaring Mars on the 22nd of August, the same day that the Sun moves into Virgo. At the end of the month, Mercury finally stations direct and ends its retrograde period on the 28th, and then Venus moves into the sign of Libra on the 29th. And that brings us more or less to the end of the month. So those are some things we're going to be talking about. Here's the planetary movements calendar. Madeline from honeycomb.co helped me to design this sort of overview graphic to show how some of those different transits overlap, and especially how they all cluster up around the middle of the month, especially in the late second week and early third week, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. And this is the Mars-Uranus conjunction that we're coming off of, that we're going to be talking about in terms of the news in July and how we transition into talking about some of the other alignments in August. All right, so hey, welcome. It's been a crazy month since we last checked in at the end of June. How have you been processing all the news and events?
I don't know that I've completely processed everything. You know, there's so much that's happened possesses a wide range of implications, many of which are mutually exclusive. It sure was interesting to watch it all happen, you know, because we've been looking at that Mars-Uranus algol conjunction, I don't know, since at least last fall, when we were prepping for the yearly. And so it was interesting to watch it all go down. You know, there's definitely been a lot of, I guess we call it astrologer good, or astrology good, where the astrology is bang on and there's a certain satisfaction in that. But the events foretold are of a bloody, ruthless, chaotic, and destructive character, and so you're not happy about that. You know, yeah. So it's you know it it twists your perspective a little bit sometimes. You know, being an astrologer and expecting things to go a certain way, and then when they go that way and it's negative, you have a certain satisfaction, and yet, you know, horror is still horror. So there's been a lot of that.
Yeah, we've been talking about that Mars-Uranus conjunction and how rough it looked since, you know, our year ahead forecast we recorded back in December. And I actually put together a little compilation on the YouTube channel of us talking about the Mars-Uranus conjunction that would happen in mid-July and just anticipating how rough it would be. We also anticipated it would be tied in specifically with events with Donald Trump. I said that it would be an explosive week for him, which turned out to be the case, and we'll get into why in just a moment. But yeah, it's one thing, you know, sort of like making predictions and seeing the alignments come up, but then just there were so many events, so many news stories that matched that Mars-Uranus in different ways, depending on how it's hitting different people's charts. It was really extraordinary to watch.
Yeah, and it shows the difficulty of making a single prediction out of an alignment that is true for everywhere on Earth. You know, with Donald Trump, it hit his midheaven, but there are other people who did not get shot at who have the midheaven around those degrees, and also, you know that it's going to be more than one thing. There will be a thing that is the biggest thing that will go in the Wikipedia and go in the news, and you know, it's nice, and it would be nice to get that thing, but you know, that alignment wasn't just that assassination attempt, right? You know, we've got the whole list, but you know, it was the blue screen of death. It was an escalation of hostilities and an exchange of explosives between the Houthis in Yemen and Israel. It was, you know, it was a bunch of stuff, and then, you know, 10,000 personal examples.
Yeah, for sure. So there were so many news stories. There's actually too many news stories to cover them all this month. We're going to do our best to cover some of the ones that seem to have the most compelling astrological correlations that we noticed, and we'll run through a bunch of those now, and then we'll see if we can get to some additional ones that we'll mention in passing later. But of course, yeah, we'll see what we can cover. We're going to shoot for 1 hour for this news section. All right, so let's talk about the Mars-Uranus conjunction. I did want to show a graphic again for that, which is from Madeline at honeycomb.co, where she actually recently put up a resources page where you can download this graphic and others from honeycomb.co/resources. So it just shows the Mars-Uranus conjunction that formed, and it went exact at 26 degrees of Taurus on July 15th. But of course, like all aspects, it had an orb where it was in effect essentially for, and seemed to be at its most intense, leading up to about a week before the conjunction and until about a week after. The 3-degree range seemed to be particularly potent, and that range was roughly between July 10th and July 21st. So Austin, you had noted that this was going to be a particularly difficult conjunction because it was on the fixed star algol, which was negative often in different astrological traditions.
Yeah, almost all of them. Algol shows up historically with a great variety of with high death tolls, big scary events, high death tolls, and very sadly very often it involves the death of innocent people, and that's part of why Algol stands out in the traditional literature as being associated with evil, right? One of its names is literally translates to the head of Satan, right? It's also the head of the Gorgon. The Chinese title translates, I believe, roughly to trenches for corpses. But you see it like some of the famous instances involve the Guernica bombing, which was massive civilian death toll in the Spanish Civil War. There was a Mars-Uranus conjunction on it, with Saturn attending in 1942 when the Soviets carried out the extermination of a lot of Polish people. It's just got a fearsome reputation. It was also the key star for that predicted the fate of Princess Diana. She had Venus on Algol. And so, it's got a well-earned and fearsome reputation. It's certainly more complex if you're dealing with it in an individual birth chart than just evil. But as sort of a mundane signifier, the combination of that star with a malefic is hardly a good sign that things are going to go well and nobody's going to get hurt.
Yeah, for sure. So our first major event that coincided with that was that former President Donald Trump was nearly assassinated on July 13th when a lone gunman started shooting at him at a campaign rally, and a bullet grazed and hit Trump's ear, making him bleed, and then dropped to the ground where he was covered by Secret Service people. So in his astrological chart, this was actually hitting him very personally, where the Mars-Uranus conjunction at 25-26 Taurus was actually hitting his midheaven, the place that has to do with career and reputation, at 24 degrees of Taurus. But also the Mars-Uranus conjunction was very closely squaring his natal Mars in the first whole sign house at 26 degrees of Leo, which is of course conjunct his ascendant at 29 degrees of Leo. And that was the part that made it more personally, physically dangerous for him, since the first house represents the body. And I had weirdly, just earlier that week, I'd used an example of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who had Mars in the first house in a date chart, and he was famously assassinated, and that's what started World War I. So it was interesting seeing almost an example where you almost had something similar there that same week.
Yeah, it's pretty striking. One of the things,
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 9 Palestinians were killed overnight as Israel's military carried out its largest raid in the occupied West Bank in 2 decades. Israeli soldiers backed by armored vehicles, bulldozers, fighter jets, and drones launched simultaneous raids on Jenin, Tulkarem, and Tubas. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society reports Jenin's 3 main hospitals were besieged with Israeli soldiers, barring ambulances from transporting the wounded. Other witnesses described Israeli bulldozers destroying roads, water, and power infrastructure. As the raid got underway, Israel's foreign minister, Israel Katz, called for the mass displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank. Katz wrote on social media, quote, "We need to deal with the threat exactly as we deal with terror infrastructure in Gaza, including the temporary evacuation of Palestinian civilians and any other step needed. This is a war for everything, and we must win it," Israel's foreign minister wrote. Palestinian health officials say Israeli raids on the West Bank since October have killed over 650 Palestinians, 148 of them children. After headlines, we'll go to the occupied West Bank, to Ramallah, for the latest. Israeli attacks on the central and southern Gaza Strip have killed dozens of Palestinians over the past day. Among the dead are 6 people who were killed when an Israeli airstrike tore through residential buildings in the city of Khan Yunis.
A house was bombed, filled with residents. It had about 100 people in it, displaced people who came from Rafah and the cities around Khan Yunis. They were all bombed by F-16s. They were all children and women, all children who have no relation to the resistance or anything else. The Israeli military is committing a genocide.
In another attack, Israeli forces struck a school sheltering displaced people in Deir al-Balah, killing 8 Palestinians. And earlier today, forces killed Palestinian photojournalist Mohammed Abderrabo and his sister in an airstrike on their home in the Nuseirat refugee camp. The Palestinian Journalist Syndicate says Israel's killed at least 161 media workers since October 7th. On Tuesday, the United Nations warned Israel's continued assault on Gaza has severely hampered aid efforts and is disrupting plans to launch a mass vaccination campaign against polio next week. Israeli forces in Gaza have rescued a Bedouin Arab Muslim man who'd been kidnapped on October 7th. On Tuesday, Israeli soldiers said they found Khaled Fahan al-Qadi alone underground in a tunnel. He's the 8th hostage to be rescued. In Ukraine, at least 6 people were killed Tuesday as Russia's military continued a barrage of drone and missile attacks on critical infrastructure. Ukrainian officials have called the recent strikes the largest aerial assault since Russia's invasion in 2022. Among the dead are 4 people who were buried under the rubble of a hotel flattened by a Russian missile in the city of Kryvyi Rih. On Tuesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he hoped to present President Biden with a plan for victory next month when he visits the United States for the UN General Assembly. Zelensky said he'd also share the proposal with Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. But Zelensky ruled out any immediate ceasefire with Russia.
There can be no compromises with Putin. Dialogue today is in principle empty and meaningless because he does not want to end the war diplomatically. He does not want it. He pretends to be ready for a diplomatic way, but under the condition of giving him 30% of our land.
The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency is warning of the heightened risk of a nuclear catastrophe after Ukrainian soldiers pressed their counteroffensive deeper into Russia and close to the Kursk nuclear power plant. On Monday, IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi said after a tour of the aging nuclear facility that Ukraine and Russia must cease fighting around all nuclear sites, including Kursk and the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia power plant in Ukraine. Grossi warned the Soviet-era Kursk nuclear plant's reactors are not protected by the sort of containment domes typically found in modern nuclear facilities, making them especially vulnerable to damage from missiles or artillery fire.
Like this, equating Chernobyl with Kursk, I think is an exaggeration. But this is the same type of reactor and there is no specific protection. And this is very, very important.
In Afghanistan, the Taliban's approved a wide-ranging morality law that forces women to completely cover their bodies and remain silent in public. The law will be enforced by the so-called morality police who work under the Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. The law codifies many rules that have been in place since the Taliban returned to power 3 years ago. The law has been widely condemned. This is Ravina Shamdasani, spokesperson for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
These are partners who are being completely silenced and they're attempting to render them into shadows. Their voices are no longer permissible. Education is no longer permissible. You cannot even see their faces. This needs to stop and we need to continue talking about it. We need to continue advocating for it and putting pressure on the authorities to listen.
Afghan women have been defying the Taliban's edicts in videos posted on social media or shared with human rights groups. This is a woman living inside Afghanistan who concealed her identity as she recorded herself singing, "You have silenced my voice until further notice. You have imprisoned me in my home for the crime of being a woman."
زدی تا امر ثانی مهر خاموشی دهانم را مهیا میکنی تو امر سانی آب و نانم را مرا با جرم زن بودن اسیر خانه‌ام کردی.
In India, protests are continuing over the rape and murder of a young medical student in a Kolkata hospital earlier this month. On Tuesday, police fired water cannons and tear gas as thousands marched in Kolkata to demand the resignation of West Bengal's chief minister. In news from Washington, D.C., Special Counsel Jack Smith has filed a revised indictment against Donald Trump for his efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Trump faces the same criminal charges in the case, but Smith reworked parts of the original indictment after the Supreme Court granted Trump broad immunity for official acts he took as president. The case is not expected to go to trial before the November election. In campaign news, Donald Trump's added 2 former Democrats to his transition team, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and former Hawaii Congressmember Tulsi Gabbard. Kennedy suspended his independent presidential campaign this weekend, but his name will likely remain on the ballot in some states. Kennedy's reportedly aiming to become Secretary of Health and Human Services if Trump is elected. Kennedy, who was once a prominent environmental lawyer, is a leading figure in the anti-vaccine movement. He has endorsed Trump despite once calling him a, quote, terrible president. And in Mexico, President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has paused relations with the U.S. and Canadian embassies after the 2 countries criticized Mexico's efforts to reform its judiciary system. Part of the reform calls for judges to be elected by popular vote. Mexico's president-elect, Claudia Sheinbaum, who will take office October 1st, defended the proposed changes.
What's best, justices of the Supreme Court elected by the Senate of the Republic or by the people of Mexico? Who says the people of Mexico? Raise your hand. This is democracy. Democracy to elect the president, democracy for lawmakers, and democracy for the judiciary too, so that it is a judiciary at the service of the people.
Last week, U.S. Ambassador Ken Salazar criticized Mexico's judicial reform proposal, saying, quote, popular direct election of judges is a major risk to the functioning of Mexico's democracy. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Discussing the large-scale structure of the cosmos, astronomers sometimes say that space is curved, or that the universe is finite but unbounded. whatever are they talking about? Let's imagine that we are perfectly flat. I mean absolutely flat. And that we live, appropriately enough, in a flat land. A land designed and named by Edwin Abbott, a Shakespearean scholar who lived in Victorian England. Everybody in flatland is, of course, exceptionally flat. We have squares, circles, triangles, we all scurry about. We can go into our houses and do our flat business. Now, we have width and length, but no height at all. Now, these little cutouts have some little height, but let's ignore that. Let's imagine that these are absolutely flat. That being the case, we know, as flatlanders, about left-right, and we know about forward-back, but we have never heard of up-down. Let us imagine that into flatland, hovering above it, comes a strange three-dimensional creature which, oddly enough, looks like an apple. And the three-dimensional creature sees an attractive, congenial-looking square, watches it enter its house, and decides in a gesture of interdimensional amity to say hello. Hello, says the three-dimensional creature. How are you? I am a visitor from the third dimension. Well, the poor square looks around his closed house, sees no one there, and what's more, has witnessed a greeting coming from his insides, a voice from within. He surely is getting a little worried about his sanity. The three-dimensional creature is unhappy about being considered a psychological aberration, and so he descends to actually enter flatland. Now, a three-dimensional creature exists in flatland only partially. Only a plane, a cross-section through him can be seen. So, when the three-dimensional creature first reaches flatland, it's only the points of contact which can be seen, and we'll represent that by stamping the apple in this ink pad and placing that image in flatland. And as the apple were to descend through, slither by flatland, we would progressively see higher and higher slices, which we can represent by cutting the apple. So the square, as time goes on, sees a set of objects mysteriously appear from nowhere and inside a closed room and change their shape dramatically. His only conclusion could be that he's gone bonkers. Well, the apple might be a little annoyed at this conclusion, and so, not such a friendly gesture from dimension to dimension, makes a contact with the square from below and sends our flat creature fluttering and spinning above flatland. At first, the square has no idea what's happening. He's terribly confused. This is utterly outside his experience. But after a while, he comes to realize that he is seeing inside closed rooms in flatland. He is looking inside his fellow flat creatures. He is seeing flatland from a perspective no one has ever seen it before to his knowledge. Getting into another dimension provides as an incidental benefit a kind of X-ray vision. Now our flat creature slowly descends to the surface, and his friends rush up to see him. From their point of view, he has mysteriously appeared from nowhere. He hasn't walked from somewhere else. He's come from some other place. They say, for heaven's sake, what's happened to you? And the poor square has to say, well, I was in some other mystic dimension called up. And they will pat him on his side and comfort him, or else they'll ask, well, show us, where is that third dimension? Point to it. And the poor square will be unable to comply. But maybe more interesting is the other direction in dimensionality. What about the fourth dimension? Now, to approach that, let's consider a cube. We can imagine a cube in the following way. You take a line segment and move it at right angles to itself and equal length. That makes a square. Move that square in equal length at right angles to itself, and you have a cube. Now, this cube, we understand, casts a shadow. And that shadow we recognize. It's, ordinarily drawn in third grade classrooms as two squares with their vertices connected. Now, if we look at the shadow of a three-dimensional object in two dimensions, we see that, in this case, not all the lines appear equal. Not all the angles are right angles. The three-dimensional object has not been perfectly represented in its projection in two dimensions, but that's part of the cost of losing a dimension in the projection. Now, let's take this three-dimensional cube and project it, carry it through a fourth physical dimension. Not that way, not that way, not that way, but at right angles to those three directions. I can't show you what direction that is, but imagine that there is a fourth physical dimension. In that case, we would generate a four-dimensional hypercube, which is also called a tesseract. I cannot show you a tesseract because I and you are trapped in three dimensions. But what I can show you is the shadow in three dimensions of a four-dimensional hypercube or tesseract. This is it. And you can see it's two nested cubes, all the vertices connected by lines. And now the real tesseract in four dimensions would have all the lines of equal length and all the angles right angles. That's not what we see here, but that's the penalty of projection. So you see, while we cannot imagine the world of four dimensions, we can certainly think about it perfectly well. Now, imagine a universe just like Flatland, truly
chords for your beautiful self. Thank you. 24/5/2024. Energy vibration is 10. The wheel of fortune, of karma, karmic cycles, new chapters, evolution and revolution. Keep your wheels of life turning. Keep your chakric system turning and illuminate as you glow, grow and flow in light. I am continuing to part 3, which is an extension of part 1 and 2 of the 3D into 5D. These parts were posted 19 and 26 November, respectively. If you have listened, it is definitely worth a good listen. This is an extension of that. It's been a long time since I have finally listened to it, so go ahead and wait. There's always a time. So here we are. I have often spoken about the dark entities or the dark overlords, etc., in readings, that they control the system, and many of us want to know who they are. I don't have all the details, in a sense that I can give you microscopic information. That is not possible because Spirit doesn't reveal everything. Of course, it is not for us to know the details. We become fixated and it just creates more blockage in our lives to perceive things in a dark and
Terrence Howard is about to lift the veil on the
Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa. It's one of the most biologically